Good afternoon. I'm George Hanlon, Director of Grants at Indiana Humanities. Thank you for joining us today as we celebrate Bookmark Indy. Bookmark Indy is a program that Indiana Humanities introduced this spring to call attention to many of the authors who have called Indianapolis home. It's a literary exploration of Indianapolis featuring 19 sites around the city that are associated with local writers. At each site, you can learn about a different author and read excerpts of the author's work. You can visit the sites in person. We have a physical marker at each, or you can explore them online at bookmarkindy.com. If you take the virtual tour, you'll find other interactive features at each site, such as photos, interpretive essays, and art and music that contemporary artists have created in response to the featured author's work. Since the launch of Bookmark Indy in April, Indiana Humanities has been hosting a series of programs featuring the 19 sites and authors. This week, we highlight the Garfield Park Stop, and we honor author Alan Helms, who grew up near Garfield Park on Cruft Street. Helms was born in Indianapolis in 1955 and he was born in Indianapolis in 1937, and he graduated from Manual High School in 1955. After high school, he moved to New York City to attend Columbia University. And while in the city, he became integrated into its gay social scene. He hung out with people like Leonard Bernstein, Noel Coward, Stephen Sondheim, and others. I will also point out that he was very young and attractive, so you can imagine the interesting times that he had in the 1950s and 1960s in New York. Helms is still alive. He's now Professor Emeritus of English at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. He wrote about his Indianapolis boyhood and his New York years in a 1995 memoir called Young Man from the Provinces, A Gay Life Before Stonewall. Our program today takes us back to mid-20th century Indianapolis when Alan Helms was growing up here. Of course, gay culture was mostly hidden back then, but at least one aspect was more visible. Drag queens who performed in jazz clubs along Indiana Avenue, which, as many of us know, was the heart of Indianapolis's African-American community. Today, we're going to learn more about these performers. Our presenter is Stephen Lane, who is the Indianapolis Special Collections Librarian at the Indianapolis Public Library. In his role, Stephen collects materials that shed light on the history of the Circle City. He often focuses his attention on researching and sharing stories of people and events that are often untold. Stephen's been researching the Indiana Avenue drag queens since his time as a graduate student in IUPUI's public history program, and we're delighted to have him with us this afternoon to share his knowledge and insight. Stephen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, George, and everyone else at Indiana Humanities. I am looking forward to sharing my research with everyone today. I'm going to start sharing my screen here. And let's see here. Saying this is the research that I worked on at IUPUI in the public history program. And you see that I changed the title for my presentation to The Female Impersonators of Indiana Avenue versus the Drag Queens of Indiana Avenue, as the performers at that time would have preferred the title of Female Impersonators. And one anthropologist in the 60s, Esther Newton, who did her research on gay culture and drag culture at that time, asked them, why they preferred female impersonators over drag queens. And they responded that they prefer female impersonator because it had a more prestige to it. It also reflected that they worked on the stage. But as we know, and drag queen at that time was more of a pejorative, but as we know, language changes over time, and a lot of trans women do participate in drag culture. So I believe that's part of the reason why we don't go by female impersonators any longer. So you will hear me throughout this presentation go back and forth between female impersonators and drag queens. I just wanted to make sure that we're aware that some of the language throughout the presentation is a little dated, as it is with history. So the picture that you see on your screen was published in the Indianapolis Recorder, which is our longest running Black newspaper here in the city of Indianapolis. And these queens, and this picture was published in 1969 in the Recorder. And it's a very visible place in downtown Indianapolis as one of our war memorial monuments. And they're on the steps of that, and they're advertising a show coming up at a local lodge and the Madam Walker Theater. So even the Walker Theater hosted drag shows throughout its history. And I wanted to highlight another one of the queens from the 60s, who is Candy, Live the Life I Love, Laverne. And she is advertising the annual Christmas show that took place at the Madam Walker Theater. And this was a benefit show for the Indianapolis Recorder. And I want to highlight her because when I first gave this presentation here in Indianapolis, right here in this reading room, one of the audience members, she came up to me afterwards. It was a white woman, and she remembered seeing Candy Laverne performing in one of these in a drag club. So it was really cool to see that there are still people here in the city of Indianapolis who have living memory of some of these drag queens I'm going to talk about today. So here you see a picture of Indiana Avenue in 1942. And you can see it's quite a bustling space. There's a lot of cars on the street. There's a trolley. There's people walking around. So this is the view from New York and Indiana Avenue. So if you're looking at the top of the screen where my cursor is, you'll see the Madam Walker Theater in the distance there. So yeah, I really got into this research in my public history class. You know, we were all thinking of, you know, what we're going to write about. I knew I wanted to go from the lens of LGBTQ history of Indianapolis. And I remember sitting in that class and my professor was talking about gay clubs that used to exist along Indiana Avenue. So I definitely perked up at the possibility of doing my research on the intersection of LGBTQ history as well as Black history here in the city of Indianapolis. And with the advances in digital research and text mining that have allowed me to examine the visibility of gay Black men involved in the Black entertainment industry of Indianapolis through the 1930s through the 1970s. And my research indicates that drag shows happen with regularity along Indiana Avenue as a way for gay Black men to gain useful employment, as well as create a level of tolerance and visibility in the Black community of Indianapolis. So this is that same intersection, and I grabbed this picture off Google Maps from 2017. But as you can see, it's pretty much the same now in 2021. But as you can see, a lot of those buildings are gone. There's a lot of surface level parking lots, and in that distance, you still can see the Madam Walker Theater. So I thought it was important to study Black drag queens, you know, just to really explore the contributions that gay Black men and Black trans women have made to the history of Indianapolis and the historical development of Indiana Avenue. Like we definitely learn about those jazz players and musicians, and we learn about Madam Walker. And so it's important that we also include these gay Black men into that narrative, as they were a big part of Indiana Avenue's history. I also wanted to just kind of get a sense of what did gay visibility looked like pre-Stonewall here in Indianapolis. Like we like to think of Stonewall riots in 1969 New York City as our big coming out moment. And you know, before we were, gay people were in the closet, and then after 1969, now we're out and we're visible and things like that. So I really wanted to see what the reality was. What did it look like pre-Stonewall here in Indianapolis, to be a gay Black person living here. I also feel like queer history largely ignores the Black contributions to constructing a queer identity. So I wanted to see what that looked like. All right. So I did a lot of research using the Indianapolis Recorder. That was probably my most useful resource. I used a lot of outdated terms or offensive language to do this research. And you will see a lot of homophobic articles come up throughout my presentation, like the one that is currently on the screen, criticizing the Pansy Ball that happened in the 1930s along Indiana Avenue. But I take that as a sign, you know, if there's presence of homophobia in the paper, there must be a presence of queer visibility somewhere out there happening. So I wanted to definitely explore what that looked like. Sorry, my presentation is acting a little funny. I'm gonna start it over to make sure, see if it doesn't just keep scrolling. There we go. All right. So I'll talk about a few of the influencing works that helped me through my research, like Laura Grantmeyer, who did her research on drag queens of the Pittsburgh Hill District from the 1920s to the 1960s. And her paper is titled, "They Lived Their Life and They Didn't Bother Anybody." And so I didn't find any pictures of the drag queens performing in the Indiana Avenue jazz clubs. However, Laura found some that were in a few archives out there in Pittsburgh of drag queens performing. So I kind of take those as examples of what it would have looked like here in Indiana Avenue. So the picture you see on your screen is a drag performer, Gilda, and she has a backup dancer with her, and they're performing a Caribbean-themed floor show. And another researcher I want to highlight is Kevin Mumford, who wrote his book, Inner Zones, Black White Sex Districts in Chicago and New York in the early 20th century. So he really talks about during Prohibition that went into effect in 1919, how a lot of the vice that took place throughout the city, like gambling, prostitution, and drinking, all of that were taken out of white areas and pushed into Black communities. So it wasn't that people didn't want to enjoy vice or these vices. It was just that they didn't want to see it in their communities. So Black people were pretty much forced to have these kind of underground economies working. And so that was definitely the case along Indiana Avenue, where a lot of the vice was concentrated in Indianapolis. And I would say, you know, that with this mixture of vice and sex work and jazz, which is a very expressive art form, it definitely celebrates the human experience and human sexuality. I would say that, you know, with these three things mixing along Indiana Avenue, it created a space where gay Black people and Black trans women had a level of visibility in the public. So in order to understand these drag queens and what happened to them, I like to give a brief overview of the history of Indiana Avenue. So the records show in 1870, there were 974 Black residents along Indiana Avenue. And in that time period, it would have been considered very undesirable land. It was really close to the White River and Fall Creek, which were prone to flood back then, as well as you're close to the canal, which was a dumping site for trash and had a lot of mosquitoes. So, and the land around those waterways were very swampy at that time. So it was very undesirable land, but it was one of the few places where Black people could live here in the city. And so they really took that land and built it to what we saw in that 1942 picture, this just bustling Black entertainment district. In 1919, you start seeing prohibition goes into effect and vice is concentrated along Indiana Avenue. I know Paul Mullins did research on a red light district that was on the east side of Indianapolis, um, or near east side of Indianapolis, close to downtown. That was pretty much shut down in 1919, and all of those jobs kind of moved underground and concentrated along Indiana Avenue. In 1933, Indiana Avenue hosts its very first Pansy show. So this would not be the first female impersonator show that Indiana Avenue has hosted, as research shows that they hosted female impersonator shows beginning in the late 1800s. And these shows would come in through traveling minstrel groups, and they didn't have like a sexual orientation attached to it. But when you call something a pansy show, that definitely changes, who the actors are, and that they are performing gay men um, at that time. In 1950, the city begins to buy property along Indiana Avenue. Housing restrictions are relaxed a little bit, so middle class Black people were allowed to move to other parts of the city. And then you start to see in 1970 that the housing is reduced by half, and Unigov goes into effect, which dilutes the Black political power from approaching 20% down to 7%. And you see the IUPUI is expanding in a poor Black neighborhood close to Indiana Avenue. And yeah, so after 1970, you start seeing, unfortunately, a lot of the drag queens that I'm going to talk about. You start seeing the jobs going away, and then you start seeing a lot of articles that talk about how many of them were getting into sex work and violent crime. But I'm going to take you back to the 1930s. So here's a map of Indiana Avenue as it existed with all the jazz clubs. And right there, where you see the red arrow, is pointing to Raymond D's Paradise Garden at 427 Indiana Avenue. And so Raymond D, he was the very first person to host a pansy ball at his venue. And so I will talk a little bit about that. So you see here in the headline that was published August 5th, 1933, look out, New York, Indianapolis now has its own copyright fairy show. And I'll read the first part of this article for you. For the first time in the 112 years since a group of pioneers settled here in Indianapolis, has caught up with New York, Chicago, Washington, Atlantic City, and Paris. Believe it or not, Indianapolis has had its very first fairy, fag, pansy, sissy public stage show and dance. So they used all the terminology all at once. 15 young men, actually a misnomer, changed the conventional garb of their sex last Thursday night, bedecked themselves in female attire that shriveled the hearts of many a true member of the weaker sex with envy, and proceeded to give a first-class girl show to the utter delight of 2,000 thrill seekers who gladly parted with the 2 bits and a dime admission price. and fully another 1,000 people were unable to get in at any price, for there wasn't even standing room left. And I'll read a little bit from my research paper here. The performers of the first Pansy show dressed as female impersonators and sang the great jazz hits of the day, such as Stormy Weather, performed by Francis Davis, or real name Harold Blakey, and Honey, Won't You Please Come Home, performed by the chorus of 15 female impersonators. The Pansy Show received a positive review in the Recorder, which was quite critical of the protesters of the first Pansy Show. The article opens, quote, a jaded city conscience, long since lulled into a state of coma through tolerance of baseball pool lotteries, back alley crap games, strip poker parties, illicit love triangles, and promiscuous running around by both husband and wives, literally opened its eyes wide in amazement, then sat up straight in surprise, and finally emitted howls of hypocritical condemnation, at the same time affecting the pose of closing its nostrils between the thumb and forefinger, unquote. The paper charged these protesters for their hypocrisy of tolerance of illegal activities and infidelity, but directed their fury at the very first ever Pansy show. To follow was pushback from the law abiding members of the Black community. The Pansy performers were certainly members of the local Black community, where they went to the same grocery stores, barbershops, saloons, and churches that lined Indiana Avenue and surrounding neighborhoods. In 1933, an anonymous letter to the editor titled For Decency's Sake makes two truths clear among the homophobic people of Indianapolis and everyone else: that gay people have always had some level of visibility in Indianapolis society, and that their very existence holds back Black progress, with quote, this type of character has always existed, but it should be made to remain in the background, um, and not be allowed to raise its ugly head and mingle in society. As a matter of fact, every pansy in town should be loaded on a discarded battleship, towed to sea, and blown up. The letter continues, there are outcasts of every race of people, but I'm almost certain that we have a surplus, which is extremely detrimental to the progress of the right-thinking, law-abiding, unquote. The letter writer was aware of the vice that thronged in the Black community and invoked the power of authorities that turned a blind eye to the vice that persisted along Indiana Avenue. The visible gay Black men were conflated with gangs, prostitution, gambling, and drinking. So again, just to kind of illustrate what these pansy balls or drag shows would have looked like back then, I used the research of Laura Grantmeyer and the picture she found in the Pittsburgh Hill District, and Gilda performing on the left, and you see her all dressed up, and she's performing with a full jazz ensemble behind her in a Granville Hotel in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And on the right, you see her performing a floor show with a backup dancer. And what I really like about the picture on the right is that it really confirms Kevin Mumford's theory of, of sex districts, and just that they were a space where white people would go and take in a drag show and also drink and gamble and all those things. But yeah, you definitely see a very mixed audience there, and so people were just kind of getting together and enjoying the entertainment. So there was backlash, there were police raids, and there was resistance. So, quote from this article, Chief Michael F. Morrissey of the Indianapolis Police Department and his efficient staff officers are to be highly commended for their actions Saturday night in frustrating what would have been a veritable theatrical exhibit of the entire local colony of degenerates. A bold attempt by promoters of this scheme to pollute the social atmosphere of the community with a new type of stenchy indecency, unquote. The letter of praise to Chief Morrissey's reaction to the pansy balls does not mention that Morrissey was willing to overlook the vice occurring along Indiana Avenue, but he did not allow the new type of stenchy indecency to fester in an open environment. Quote, Informed of the plans of the leaders of the Pansy Ball crowd to spit in the face of common decency by turning their nasty experiment into an annual affair, unquote. A statement that suggests the promoters of the Pansy Balls were aware of their popularity since the Pansy Balls were planned annually. The pushback from some Black community members prompted club promoters to refer to Pansy Balls as female impersonator shows in the future. Quote, with Chief Morrissey's disapproval registered against all such programs for Indianapolis, backed by an outraged public, pansy dancers will have to look elsewhere for a field in which to entertain, unquote. Yet Indiana Avenue operated as the interzone for Indianapolis, which severely limited where gay Black men could entertain. In 1934, the Pansy performers had more run-ins with Chief Morrissey. Quote, Sally Rand has lost her fan. Give it back, you nasty man. The Sally Rand was the Pansies who gave a female impersonation at the Grand Terrace last Friday night and were raided by the police. The nasty mans were the coppers who stopped the show. They were good enough not to arrest the boys, and there's quotations around boys. They complain loud and long that they are decent and should be let alone. Chief Morrissey has other ideas. This is about the fourth run-in the lads have had with the boys in blue, who are determined that they shall not show. More power to them. I mean the police. Unquote. The open resistance from the Pansy performers against Chief Morrissey and his officers prevented their arrests. Morrissey's mission to put an end to Pansy shows on the Avenue meant that he saw Pansy performers as an unacceptable form of entertainment. While the Pansy craze was met with little resistance in other major cities like Chicago, New Orleans, and New York, in Indianapolis, there was open resistance from some members of the Black community, with the threat of the police chief to intervene. The Pansy shows were not allowed to continue with the explicit homosexuality. The Pansy performers resisted loss of employment in the Black entertainment industry through open protest of Chief Morrissey's police raids and cleverly transformed their act to drop sexual reference to sexual orientation out of their show promotions and continued their craft as female impersonators. So like I said before, female impersonators isn't new to Indiana Avenue or Indianapolis at this time, but when you call it the Pansy Ball, it definitely had that gay sexual orientation attached to it. So they were really trying to keep the fuzz off their backs, so they had to go back to using the former title of female impersonator. And but this first Pansy Ball in 1933 really opened up these great community conversations that were also published in the Indianapolis Recorder, and I'm very thankful that the editors, that the community, that the writers were participating in these conversations, and that we actually have on record what they thought about gay people in 1934 here in Indianapolis. So I'll read some of these responses to this community poll of what is your opinion of pansies or fags? S.W. Whitley of 2259 North Capitol Avenue, who was an insurance executive, said, if I were mayor or governor, I would have every single one of them thrown in the can. I think they're the nastiest people alive. There was a time when this sort of person was very modest and respectful, but now they're extremely too bold for any good. So even in 1934, with this response, you also see that, Whitley is admitting that gay people have always had some existence throughout his life. And he said, even references, there was a time when they were more modest and respectful than, being out and visible in the community. Then the Reverend J.C. Crocker of 1428 Martindale Avenue, who was a fancy penmanship writer. I don't know how you get that job. I definitely couldn't get it with my handwriting. He says, I believe that some folk are born that way and others acquire the habit. They amuse me, so I have to stand and watch them whenever I see them. So you see there's a little more tolerance there with his response, and there's definitely that idea of nature versus nurture in terms of how people are gay, I guess. So that conversation is very old. It goes back to the 1930s. I'll read a little bit more. There were letters of support, such as the letter submitted by Mrs. Holloway, printed in the Recorder following the backlash. Mrs. Holloway's letter, printed September 9th, 1933, reads, Editor, having read in your Worthy Weekly an article deriding and censoring the recent female impersonators, and she only puts quotations around impersonators here, review, I, along with others, became interested in knowing what the reason was for such attack. It seems to me that a little too much stress has been put on some forms of amusements, while others, far more detrimental, are allowed to be tolerated. Unquote. Mrs. Holloway referred to the stag parties held at the casino where men only were admitted, quote, for the sole purpose of satisfying a lust and passion of the lowest degree. The show, gladly given by a number of au fait women, was a source of pleasure for our gentlemen, some of whom, mind you, were indignant at the suggestion of an effort by our unfortunate members of the intermediate sex to entertain in a perfectly proper and legitimate manner. So I really like that letter from Mrs. Holloway, because I think she is very progressive in her thinking and really is defending that these female impersonator shows keep going and that they're supported by the community. And she's more critical of other kinds of things like the sex work that happens at the casino, um, and things like, and gambling as well in her letter. So I think it just really goes to show how she even calls them the intermediate sex, referring to some of the performers, and even admitting that some of the female impersonators, where she put quotations around impersonators, were probably would probably identify more as trans women in today's terminology. So I wanted to highlight a few of these pictures in the Indianapolis Recorder of other kind of views of homosexuality or gayness, queerness, that happened throughout the country that they highlighted in some of their articles. So what you see a picture on the left of 3 female impersonators at the Republic Club, which was a nightclub in Washington, D.C. And this was published in the Recorder April 30th, 1938. And this article is really interesting because it's going over the history of homosexuality in 1938, and it's really looking at it from a very objective, mostly objective, perspective. So kind of tracing it back to ancient times to what anthropologists were saying about homosexuality in 1938. So it was a very interesting article, and I encourage you all to read it. You can look at it through the IUPUI's digital Indianapolis Recorder collection. In the middle, you have a picture of female impersonator Mae West, who is from Kansas City, Missouri, and she performed on Indiana Avenue and another venue on the east side of downtown of Indianapolis. And her picture was published in the Recorder on July 13th, 1935. And on the right, you see a picture of Carol, a female impersonator singer, before her reported surgery in Copenhagen. This photo was published February 25th in 1967, and the article is titled Would Rather Switch. And Carol is quoted as saying, Black women in America are among the luckiest on the face of the earth, and it will be marvelous to be one. Gay Black men and Black trans women were visible on the stages of Indiana Avenue and on its city sidewalks. Pansies lived in the apartments lining the avenue as early as 1935. In the 1940s, gay Black men and Black transgender women were openly walking the avenue. Column writer St. Clair Gibson wrote an open letter to Recorder staff writer Opal Tandy, who was in Europe fighting in World War II. February 17th, 1940, published his update to Tandy of the goings-on back home. In the middle of the letter, Gibson wrote, quote, several new he-she's are now strutting the avenue with their hair marceled down to the bricks. We even saw one wearing earrings. Some of the less timid males are trying to put them on the make. It's the same old thing, pal. There are all kinds of freaks, and we guess they'll be with us always, unquote. But a reader responded to Gibson's column letter with a letter of support for gay Black men and Black transgender women. Quote, I read your letter to the soldiers overseas, which I thought was very nice to send them the hometown news. But one thing you didn't mention to him was what the Negroes are doing in Indianapolis to help win the war. You dished him all the other dirt but that. Mr. Gibson, you made a statement concerning the freaks, which was out of bounds. That is my opinion. The News, Star, or at Times wouldn't have dared to print in their papers about their people, which you put in the Recorder about freaks of our race. Suppose everybody in this big world was just like you. Tell me what kind of a place would this be to live in? So that is why God made different kinds of vegetables and fruits. For those who dislike one, will have the choice of the other. Every real he-man with pants on is not a man. Every woman in a dress with a dress on is not a real woman. Indianapolis will always be a Southern town because it is made up of Southern Negroes and whites who do not know the Civil War is over. And as long as you are around, there will always be different kinds of people. Signed, a citizen of Indianapolis, unquote. Gibson admitted that the reader fan had a point in the letter and confessed, quote, we didn't mean any offense to those persons who practice or approve this sort of thing. We as human beings know that this sort of thing will be going on long after this old bedraggled body is a molding in the cold, cold ground, unquote. The reader's letter invokes God, who makes different types of fruit and vegetables as he does people to appeal to a religious audience. The most progressive paragraph was the last, where the reader wrote about transgender people existing and how exhausting it was to deal with conservative people by labeling Indianapolis citizens Southern people. Gibson struggles with the last paragraph of the reader's letter, but acknowledges, quote, regardless how you feel about the writer, you must admit that he has a right to his say. And so here's an advertisement for an upcoming drag show at the Log Cabin Supper Club, and that was at 524 Indiana Avenue. And so they was featuring some performers like Ivy Anderson and Doris Duchess White. So I'll talk a little bit about Doris and her claim to fame. In Indianapolis, white people who ventured on the avenue would have experienced local female impersonator talent that received national acclaim. In 1936, Doris Duchess White made headlines as a national female impersonator icon. White's act lasted a long 16 weeks in Columbus, Ohio, and next she took on Chicago, Illinois, where she worked in the same venues as famed Pansy entertainer Frankie Half Pint Jackson. Jackson was reported to stand at 5'2" and was a powerhouse entertainer. He pleased Indianapolis audiences in 1933. Jackson was known for throwing his voice into a falsetto and singing the female parts in duets. Occasionally, he sang both the man's and woman's parts and changed the lyrics of famous jazz songs. Jackson's version of My Daddy Rocks Me has many overt sexual tones that culminate in the end with Jackson imitating what is considered the first orgasm on a recorded song while he described a sexual relationship with a man referred to as daddy. In 1937, the Recorder reported on the star power of Doris Duchess White as she traveled the Chitlin Circuit to Cincinnati, Ohio with a review of other Black entertainers. After the 14-week show at Rosebud Inn in Cincinnati, Doris reportedly said, it's time to go now, girls. In 1944, she worked 2 shows nightly at the Log Cabin Supper Club alongside newcomer female impersonator Ivy Anderson and other entertainers. By the 1950s, the Duchess worked regularly in the bars and clubs along Indiana Avenue. Doris was rarely referred to as a female impersonator. Her level of acceptance in the Black community of Indiana Avenue and her talented status may have created a status of Black woman entertainer that was rarely given to female impersonators. The advertisement seen on the screen featuring the Duchess and Ivy Anderson is very ambiguous as to whether the picture of the woman is a female impersonator or not. This advertisement plays into the awe and mystery of the craft of female impersonation that would attract patrons to attend the shows. They had to find out for themselves. And so here is another picture of Doris, and she is on the left, along with other entertainers that performed along Indiana Avenue. And this was at the Defense Workers Social Club. And this was published in the Indianapolis Recorder, April 29th, 1944. And you do not see her referred to as a female impersonator. She's just referred to as one of the entertainers, one of the performers, in the description there. So I would, so in conclusion, gay Black men and Black trans women were integral members of the Black Entertainment District of Indianapolis. Gay Black men and Black trans women were contributed to the identity of Black Indianapolis, and gay Black men and Black trans women were visible members on Indiana Avenue and reached some level of acceptance. And I think a lot of that acceptance, or a lot of the pushback that the performers received had to deal with civil rights, and if they were so visible, would people really receive their civil rights in society? I would love to see this research expanded to include the Black lesbian women and their influence on Indiana Avenue, as well as there were male impersonators as well. So thank you all so much for listening to my presentation. There's a picture of me in drag, and my work email, my Twitter is on there as well if you should have any more questions. But I would love to, if there's time for questions, I would love to take some.
Stephen, I'm not sure if we have the capability for people to join and ask questions or not.
Okay.
Claire tells me that we're delayed, so I'm not sure that people are live and can chime in or not. But if people do have questions, how do they reach? I see actually on the screen right there, you've got your contact information, your email. So I would say if anybody does have questions, just to shoot you an email. And you've got some other interesting activities, events coming up. Do you want to talk about a few of those?
Absolutely. So I have, we just wrapped up the LGBTQ oral history project that we're doing here for the Indianapolis Public Library. We wrapped it up with our intern that we had from IUPUI's Public History Program. And so we're going to keep that going in the fall. We're going to get started again in the fall, since she really helped me develop this program, and and the way she was able to accomplish so many interviews throughout the pandemic, with a lot of our elders in the Indianapolis community, who some of whom did not know how to use Zoom. So she was doing a great job training them on how to use Zoom. And I think we'll continue to try to capture more stories and more of our LGBTQ history here in Indianapolis. So we'll have that going on in the fall. So and what we're going to look for are volunteers. So if you would like to volunteer, please send me an email and I will definitely get you added to the list. I would love to get younger volunteers, especially younger volunteers from the LGBTQ community, to talk to our elders here in Indianapolis and learn their stories and learn their history. And I think that would just make us a stronger and more cohesive community. So, yeah.
Well, I said in my introduction that one of the things that you're great at is researching and telling untold stories. And you've done an admirable job of telling stories about the impersonators / drag queens along Indiana Avenue. And I'm delighted that you are digging deeper in doing these oral history projects and saving that history and helping to share it. So we support you in your efforts. And we're just delighted to have you today, Stephen. Thank you for joining us, and thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge and this fascinating history with us.
Thank you so much, George. I really appreciate it.
Sure. You have a great day.
You too.